Hi everyone, I wanted to give you two videos about finding the right college fit, and then the second video is going to be and finding the money to pay for it. I think there's a lot more to thinking about finding the right college for you than we tend to think. I think we tend to think about finding the right college along the lines of something that a friend said to me a while back. So my friend is a professor at the College of Education at Loyola. And he noticed that, most students sort of think about applying to school the following way, that they should go to the best, meaning most selective school you can get into that you can afford. And so the question that we're going to think through a little bit here is whether this is actually good advice, that there's certainly truth to that you can afford. And we'll talk about that in the second video. But the other piece of this is just, is it really important to go to the quote best / most selective school that you can get into? So I think there's some pros and cons of selectivity. And first, I want to say something that I'm going to repeat again at the end, which is to explain what I even mean by highly selective schools. Highly selective schools are schools that accept like 20% or fewer of their applicants. So these are sort of like what I would call like the top 50 schools. Meaning that it's very hard to get into these schools. So just keep that in mind when we're talking. I think one of the things I'll talk about at the end is like, is there a difference between, for example, Loyola, DePaul, some of those schools? Those are all sort of in the same basic tier, whereas like Northwestern, University of Chicago is what I'm talking about by these super selective schools. So here's the pros and cons, I think, of selectivity. The first thing I think it's weird when we think about highly selective schools is that no one really that I've ever met believes that if you go to a highly selective school, you get just a way better education, that your teachers are way better, you learn a lot more, etc. Now, you might have some schools that are much better resourced than others, so you might have opportunities at some institutions than you would have at others. That doesn't actually necessarily track with selectivity. Often it can be that like large research institutions have tons of research opportunities. Those aren't necessarily the same as your Harvards and Yales, et cetera. So then the question is like, well, what do you get, if anything, then from these highly selective schools? And I think in fairness, it's worth saying that there may be a couple of advantages that come from these schools. But the question for you all to consider is whether those advantages are really that significant at the end of the day. I'd say, if anything, there's a couple of advantages. One, I would sort of call pipelines as connections. Highly selective schools tend to have a high number of students who come from privileged backgrounds. They tend to have very financially successful alumni. And often those alumni might be business leaders in the community, et cetera, et cetera. And so being among those people can give you an advantage in the job search, et cetera, et cetera. One thing I noticed, I went to Boston College, which I guess you would consider a selective school, is that, many employers came to our campus to recruit, whereas at other schools, you go to job fairs to try to look for employment. So I think there's a little of that. I think the other thing that's a little hard to measure is that I think when you get a lot of people, especially when you get a lot of people from privileged backgrounds who go to highly selective environments, they tend to have very high aspirations for themselves. And sometimes that can help us sort of envision futures for ourselves that we might not otherwise have envisioned. So if everyone around you is expecting to be a lawyer or doctor, you might start thinking of yourself as potentially a lawyer or doctor, whereas you may never have thought like that in the past if you didn't know a bunch of people from that background, let's say, before then. But there is a downside to selective schools, right? As I said, a lot of these schools tend to have student populations where the majority of the students come from privileged backgrounds. So that can feel elitist. We've had some students go to a lot of these schools, and some of them have come from situations where they did not at all have any privilege, and that can cause a sense of insecurity where you might feel like you don't belong, and that can make it harder to succeed. So it's something to be aware of. I think when it comes to the value of highly selective schools, then it really depends on what you're after. And this, of course, all depends on whether you can get in and whether you can afford it. But imagine that you could say yes to those two questions. You really have to think about the pros and cons. So I think it depends on what your goals are, and if you feel like the place you're going, the people are going to be and look different from you, whether that's something you're comfortable with or not. But also it might be that, these selective schools might somewhat aid you in finding a job, but more likely it's that they help you find a slightly more competitive job. So you can get an accounting job at school X, but you could get a very highly competitive, highly sought after accounting job at school Y, right? That's maybe, okay? But it's important that even that matters more in some majors than others, right? So engineering is highly competitive, so going to a well-ranked school is going to really help you. If you study finance, if your aspirations are to sort of work as a Wall Street investment banker, then probably going to places that are highly selective might put you more on that path. My daughter has expressed interest in being a high school teacher. You can easily achieve that by going to many of the great schools in Illinois who have produced her teachers. You don't need to try to find the most selective school in the country to go into many professions where there's a high demand for people entering those professions. Really, the way that I think, though, about finding a good fit for college is that you always have to remember that success after college depends on success during college. So, even if there's some advantage to going to a highly selective school, you can easily offset that advantage by excelling wherever you are. So you can go to a not highly selective school, and if you stand out as a student, you're going to be highly competitive for graduate school and for going into a career. So the real key is being somewhere that you feel you can succeed. And so for that, I think it's always wise to consider things that go beyond academic reputation of the school. There's a lot of things that I think it helps to consider, and I would encourage you to really start to craft your description of an ideal college based on the things I'm about to go through. So one is, I think size is important to think about. Do you want to be in a huge campus, 15,000 or more students like UIC, UIUC? Do you feel more comfortable at a mid-sized school? And that's a school, I think Harper is a good example. Mid-size is defined as having between 5,000 and 15,000 students. Harper has about 11,000. It's a little bit misleading because some of our students might only take a class or two, but about that size. And then you have small schools under 5,000 students, tend to be environments where everybody knows everybody, that kind of thing. Around us, some schools that we'll be taking campus visits to that are like that are Lake Forest, Elmhurst, but there are lots of schools like that around Illinois and around the country. But you also want to consider things like location. So many of you are living at home now, and so you might want to be able to continue to live at home, and so you want to be able to commute. You might want to move out, but be able to drive home several times during a year, so maybe within 5 hours, right? But even relatively close to Harper, there's a difference between living in the heart of Chicago, like DePaul, living sort of on the edges of Chicago, like Loyola's Lakeshore campus, living in a large college town like UIUC, or going into a small town with a small college in it where there's not really else a lot there, but it feels nice and sort of cloistered, like a sort of enclosed family. But also, if you want to move far away, think about if there's a particular area of the country that you've always wanted to live, or a typical a type of geography that you're drawn to. You always feel like you are drawn to the mountains or drawn to water or drawn to the desert. This might affect, where you think about applying to school. I also think it's important to think about what I'll call the vibe, the general sort of atmosphere of a college. You know, how much does diversity matter to you, and what kinds of diversity, right? Religious diversity, ethnic diversity, LGBTQ diversity, things like that. Do you want a more liberal, ideologically liberal college? So I don't mean liberal arts. I mean, sort of on that side of the political spectrum. You want a more conservative atmosphere, or one that that's not really a thing. You don't really notice one way or the other. There's things like whether you want to be part of Greek life. This tends to be a bigger thing for freshmen than for transfer students, but some people are, it's important. Maybe you want to go to a school that's religious, and I say, or religiously informed. And what I mean by that is I went to Boston College, which is a Catholic college, and I went to Loyola, also a Catholic college. But it wasn't like anyone sat around talking about God. We didn't have to go to church and then like that. So I would call it more religiously informed, in the sense that a lot of the values of the institution were about service to others and things like that, that drew inspiration from its religious background as a school, but it wasn't like really overt, we're all about this. Then, as I say here, your aesthetics, the look and feel of a school. I think this should probably be the last consideration on your list, but if you decide to live at school, you are living a place for a couple of years, and so enjoying where you live does matter to a lot of people. So you might think about, is the campus pretty? Do they have nice dorms or apartments? How's the food? What about proximity to other food? What about things like the gym, rec centers, things like that. Of course, what's complicated, right, is the nicer all that stuff is, the higher the sticker price often is. We'll talk about that more in the second video, because it doesn't necessarily mean that college is going to be more expensive. But if you get into a couple different colleges and one just feels a lot more pleasant, you can afford both, and one feels much more pleasant, that might be something you consider. Finally, I think there's a couple of thoughts that you want to remember. First, I think it's easy. It's like this with marriage even, right? Is you find somebody you really like and you wonder, well, are they the one? Are they the perfect person for me? And I think that can be a little bit poisonous thinking. It's real easy to worry I chose this place, and what if I had chosen that place? What if that place is a little bit better? And really, it's helpful to think about types of schools. And if you feel comfortable at a place, then you're going to feel comfortable at other places like that. So don't worry about finding exact wrong fit. What you're trying to do is avoid misfits, right? You're trying to find a place where you can be happy, succeed, not have a ton of debt when you come out. Following along with that too is you don't want to over worry about ranks of schools. So when I say tiers, yes, there's a difference in selectivity between Northwestern and Loyola and Northern Illinois, UIC, whatever, right? But those are sort of like Northwestern, highly competitive, right? Loyola DePaul, a little less competitive, et cetera. But the difference between UIC, DePaul, Loyola, all those schools is pretty negligible. Even though they might be ranked differently. So don't obsess about, well, this one's ranked slightly higher than this one. Relax about that. I will say a little bit more about this when it comes to paying for school, only because there's a way to sort of use the tiers of school to help you a little bit competing for scholarships. So I'll talk about that in the next video. All right, thanks everyone.